Hello YouTube, this is Billy. Today I'm wanting to do a video on replacing a wheel stud, and this would be on a 2011 Kia Sorento. So far I've jacked the vehicle up, and before I jacked it up I loosened the lug nuts a little bit and then jacked it up and then removed the lug nuts the rest of the way. Now I'm just going to get this tire off of the vehicle and set to the side. Make sure you use your parking brake and chock the other wheels, and if you have a jack stand, strongly recommend using a jack stand to be as safe as possible. Okay, so I'm going to get this wheel set aside real quick. Okay, so now that I've got the wheel set aside, you can clearly see that this is the wheel stud that broke on me, needing to replace this wheel stud. So on this caliper, we're gonna have to get this caliper moved out of the way so we can get this rotor also out of the way to get to replace this wheel stud. So on my caliper, you've got this one right here. This rubber is real squishy, okay? This bolt, I'm gonna remove this bolt where it's got that little squishy deal there. Same thing on the bottom. This little squishy rubber right there, that bolt, I'm going to remove this bolt and remove this bolt, and with the zip tie I will be able to, once both of those bolts are removed, this center piece will move. So I will pull this up and hang it up with like a clothes hanger or a zip tie. That way there's no stress on this brake line hose here. To remove those two bolts, I'm using a 14mm on my ratchet wrench. Okay, and once you've got those two little bolts removed and set aside, this center part of the brake caliper, it will just easily pick up, and I used a zip tie it to my spring. That way it's out of the way, and that way it doesn't put any stress on that brake line. Okay, now these brake pads that are just sitting in here, we just want to slide these guys out and set these to the side. Okay, now this bracket part for the brake caliper, this needs to be also removed and set aside out of the way. So back here on this back side, you've got two bolts. You got one right here on the top. You got this one right here on top. And then you've got another one right down here, close on the bottom. I'll get these two bolts removed and get this bracket set aside. And to remove that bracket, I'm using the same 14mm. Most of the time these bracket bolts are a little tighter, so to give me a little more leverage, I've got a cheater pipe that I'm going to slide on my ratchet wrench to give me more leverage to get those broke loose. Okay, so now I've got the brake caliper bracket set aside, and these are the two bolts that came out, and you'll notice that these two bolts have those lock washers on there. So we'll get these set aside. Okay, next would be these little Phillips screws here. These little Phillips screws, they're not really all that important, so if one messes up on you, it's going to be okay, because you can actually put it back together without either one of those. All it does is hold this center piece when it's in this kind of position. In any event, I'm going to get both of these Phillips removed, and what I did is on my ratchet wrench I rigged up a little Phillips bit with a 1/4-inch socket with a reducer on my ratchet wrench. So I'm going to get those Phillips removed and set aside. Okay, so I've removed the two little Phillips screws, and we'll get these set to the side here. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is inside the vehicle, I'm going to release the emergency brake, because with the emergency brake set, it is keeping this locked down. So after turning off the emergency brake, and you've got your wheels chalked up good, and you've got a good jack stand, with that emergency brake off, you want to make sure you've got a good jack stand supporting the vehicle, and you want the other 3 wheels chalked well so that the vehicle doesn't try to fall on you in any kind of way. So in any event, now with that emergency brake off, this hub, you can just wiggle it, and as you wiggle it, just kind of pulling toward yourself, and then this piece would just set aside. Okay, so now with this piece set aside, now we can get in here where we need to be to get this wheel stud replaced. So this is our wheel stud. In my case, this is the one I'm trying to replace. So I'm going to take a hammer and tap on that to get it out. And in most cases, there's usually one particular spot around that you'd be able to go back in with the new one. We'll get to that shortly. Right now I'm just going to take a hammer and tap on this, and it's going to come out the backside. Okay, so after looking all the way around for the best spot to come out and go in with the new wheel stud, it looks like this spot right here. I've already tapped on it with the hammer. I tapped on it with the hammer like this and got it knocked loose. You see, it's just going to come back like this, and you see that hole right there. Let me go ahead and set this out. But this hole right here, it's just big enough for the head of the wheel stud to go in. So I plan on going in with the new wheel stud in that same spot. So this is the broken one. So this one's going to be really easy because it's short, because it broke. But I'll go in with the head inside that big hole there, and then line the end of it up to where it'll go in here like this. Okay, so that would be our little sweet spot to go in with the new one that's not broken longer. In any event, so now I'm going to carry this piece with me to the parts store to try to ensure that I'm getting an exact match. Now this is an OEM wheel stud, and it's kind of hard to make out what that is on it, but in any event, I will try to make sure I get an exact match to this and go in with the new one. So in my case, I'm taking both broke pieces, the lug nut that's got the piece broke off in it, and the lug stud that's broke. But I'm also taking one of the good lug nuts. That way I can make sure I get a really good match, because with the new stud, I should be able to thread on this old lug nut. You know, trying to make sure I get the correct thread match and everything. In any event, headed to the parts store now. Okay, leaving the parts store now, and while I was inside, I was able to thread the new stud with the older lug nut to ensure it was the good match on the exact threads. Now, it was only like $8.42, and the parts that I purchased were a Dorman, and these are the Dorman part numbers. For the stud, it was 610507, and for the nut was 611253, and at $8.42. It's not too bad. Now we'll get back to the house and get this in. Okay, so now with the new stud, this spot that I got my fingernail inside there, I'm gonna get the head of it to go back in there like that to try to get it to go in. Okay, so in this position, when it's just sitting in there like this, you're able to turn this very easy. So what you want to do is you want to turn it so that you can get the tip of it to start going in. It's kind of hard to do with one hand, but once you get the tip of it to barely start going in, then you turn it down more, and then you can pull it the rest of the way in. Okay, when it's in this position, it's very wiggly. So I'm going to very carefully get this rotor carefully put on there so that I can re-engage the parking brake, and then put the new lug nut on there and tighten it down. And when I tighten it down, it's going to pull this into the hub there. So, and I do have I've got a 13mm wrench that I'm going to put on to help give it a little space so that it's pulling that in good. Okay, all I did was very carefully slide this rotor back over, and you can see this is still very wiggly. I'm going to put this 13mm wrench box end over the wheel stud very carefully like that, and then I'll take the new lug nut and tighten down on it. Of course, now that this rotor is back in place, I can re-engage the parking brake, and it'll keep this all from spinning and moving while I'm tightening down on the lug to get that to seat inside that hub inside there. So that's where we're at now. I'm going to go ahead and get the parking brake re-engaged. Okay, now that I've got the parking brake engaged, that has locked that so it's not just spinning freely. Okay, and all I did was just very carefully barely start threading the new lug nut on, and okay, now it's starting to get a grip. So now we'll just take my little 4-way, and I will start getting this. As I tighten it, it seats that new stud. Okay, and once I've got it seated a little bit like that, now I'm actually going to take this back off, because right now I'm just trying to get it seated just a little bit. See, now that stud well, it didn't seat very good at all, so I'm gonna have to tighten that a little more. Okay, I just redid the same thing with both hands. Set the camera down for a second there, but now that I, with two hands, put a little tightening down on that, and now that stud has begun to seat a little, so it's not going to be seated all the way yet, but it's at least seated good enough to where it's not wiggling around. So now I can take my little 13mm box end wrench, put that on there, and then with that on there like that, now I'm going to go ahead and tighten it down more and get it seated the rest of the way like this. Okay, well, that's where I'm at now. Okay, I tightened down on it more, and I believe I've got it seated pretty good. Now, if I was wanting to see what it looks like if I've got it seated good, I can turn off the emergency brake and slide the rotor toward me and make sure it's seated all the way. Okay, so now with the parking brake disengaged, I can look at it good and see that it's about halfway seated. It's not seated all the way yet. Now, if it's seated good enough to get the tire on, I can seat that the rest of the way with the tire being on. In any event, to make sure I got this seated good, I'm just going to keep doing this where I slide the rotor on and engage the parking brake, and I'll just keep getting a good visual like this until I see that this is all the way seated, because you can see when it's all the way seated, it looks like that. And right now this one still has a gap, So I'll just keep doing this process until I get this all the way seated. Okay. Okay, I've got it more seated, and I think that's going to be good enough to go ahead and get the full assembly put back together. And whenever I put my wheel on and put my lug nuts on this particular one, I will make sure I tighten it all the way until it feels like it's completely seated. In any event, that's going to be good enough to hold it for the rest of the assembly, and then I'll get that all the way seated once the wheel and in the final assembly of tightening up the wheel. Okay. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get this wheel hub, this rotor back on there, and I'll be making sure these little screws where those two little Phillips was, that they line up with these little holes to receive the little Phillips screws. Okay, I'll get that put on real quick. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and get these little Phillips started going back in there. And these guys aren't really very tight at all, okay? So you just want to get them in there. All they do is help hold it during the assembly process. If you lost them or broke them, it'd be okay. In any event, I'm just getting them in there. I'm gonna put my little screwdriver on it and tighten it just a little here. It don't have to be very tight. Okay, there's that one. And then there's that one. See, I just went as tight as I could with my bare hand like that. That'll be fine. Okay. Now I'll get that little bracket back in place. Okay, now that I've got this little bracket back in place, I'm going to get my wrench, my ratchet wrench, and use the 14. Tighten those two bolts down good. Okay, now that I've got those two bracket bolts tightened down good, now I'm going to grab these two brake pads and get those slid back into the bracket here. Okay, now the best way to make sure you're putting the brake pads back in the exact same place, on your caliper head here, you see down inside there, you got this round caliper head that pushes on the back brake pad. So you can see that round mark on this one. That's from that caliper head pushing on this brake plate here, okay? So this one will go on the back side, and this one will go on the side closest to me. Okay, now that I've got the brake pads back in place, and it's pretty simple. You've just got this little ear on the pad. You got that little ear, and then that little ear, you just slide that bottom ear in, and then line that top ear in, and then just slide it in. And same thing on the back side. Okay, so now that these pads are back in place, now it's time to get this zip tie cut and bring this caliper head back into place. Okay, now that I've got this caliper head slid back into place and got my little bolts in as good as I could with my bare hands, now I'll take the 14mm on my ratchet wrench and get those tightened down. Now, when you tighten these two bolts down, you don't want to get too crazy with it, okay? You're dealing with aluminum and stuff here. So once it's feeling a little tight, maybe just a hair more, but do not over tighten, because it will cause you to have more expensive repairs, okay? So do not over tighten your caliper bolts there. In any event, okay? That's what I'm fixing to do, is get those tightened down a little bit. Okay, now that I've snugged down the caliper head bolts, and now I'm ready to get the wheel put on. And as I'm putting the wheel on, I'm going to make sure that the new lug nut goes on the new lug stud, and I'll be paying attention to where it's at all times. That way, whenever I get this thing lowered down to the ground, I'm going to tighten that one up all the way until it feels like it just don't want to spin no more. That way I know that this lug stud gets seated good. Okay. Okay, all I did was very carefully, the new one, I put it at the very top center, okay? And after I got it to the top center, then I re-engaged the parking brake, and I very carefully placed the wheel over, making sure I didn't bump too hard into the new wheel stud, and now that I've got the lug nuts on as tight as I can by hand, now I'm going to take the lug wrench and get them on, you know, snug them down a little bit, and then get the car lowered down to the ground to finish torquing the lug nuts down. And now that I know that I've got the new one up here, this top one is the one that I will make sure I go all the way so that that gets seated good on the inside. Okay. Okay, so using my 4-way, I tighten these down as good as I can with the vehicle still up in the air. And you want to go in a star pattern, that way it brings it nice and flush evenly. And by a star pattern, you want to go like here, 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 and here. So I've got them all tightened up pretty good with the vehicle still up in the air. So now I'm going to go ahead and lower the vehicle down to the ground and then finish torquing these down. Okay, so I just lowered the vehicle back to the ground, removed the floor jack and jack stand. And now that it's down on the ground, I will go ahead and torque these down. And since I know that this one here is my new one, this is the one I'm going to pay special attention to this one. I'm going to tighten this one down until it's just feeling like it's super good and tight. It just won't tighten no more. That way I know that stud has seated good on the inside. Okay, well, for anybody this video may help, well, good luck out there. Bye.